Before there were mythic items, before champions had 5 different forms, and way before anyone spammed diff in all chat, there were runes. But not the runes you know today. No fancy icons, no flashy keystones, just small stat boosts hidden behind paywalls and spreadsheets. You didn't pick your style, you paid for it. Literally. New to League? You probably don't remember needing to grind thousands of IP just to get plus 0.95 attack damage, and if you do, you probably just flinched at the memory. In League's earliest days, runes weren't there to give you cool new mechanics or unlock unique playstyles. They were raw, flat stat boosters. No creativity, no synergy, just numbers. There were 4 types of runes: marks, red; seals, yellow; glyphs, blue; and quintessences. Each type had its own category of stats, and once slotted into your rune page, they added small advantages. For example, marks were often used for offense, flat AD or armor pen. Seals focused on defense like armor or health regen. Glyphs leaned toward magic resist or cooldown reduction, and quints gave bigger boosts and could mix different stat types. So if you were playing AD carry, you might run flat AD marks, armor seals, magic resist glyphs, and attack speed quints, a page that gave you a noticeable edge in lane, especially in early trades. Junglers would often run attack speed marks, armor seals, and maybe gold per 10 quints to speed up clear and gold generation. The problem? These rune pages weren't just about picking what suited your champion, they were about owning them. Every single rune had to be bought with influence points, or IP, League's old in-game currency. And the prices weren't cheap. A single tier 3 quint rune could cost over 2,000 IP. You could equip 9 marks, 9 seals, 9 glyphs, and only 3 quintessences per page. 30 individual rune slots could cost well over 12 to 15k IP. That's a few weeks of grinding just for one setup. That meant new players were at a massive disadvantage. If you didn't have runes, you were simply weaker, even if you were the better player. A level 30 with full runes would completely stomp someone without them, not because of outplays, but because they were flat out stronger the moment they loaded in. It wasn't a skill gap, it was a time or grind gap. And it didn't stop there. Rune pages themselves were limited, and if you wanted more than the default 2, you had to spend RP or real money. Want to switch from a tanky top lane page to an AP mid setup between games? Too bad, you probably had to wipe and rebuild your whole page in Champ Select. It forced players to either constantly edit their setups or play with the wrong stats altogether. There were also weird rune choices that showed how outdated the system was. Things like flat mana regen per 5 seconds, percent scaling crit chance, or the infamous gold per 10 runes, which were mainly used on old school supports to make income when they couldn't CS. It was messy, and for newer players it was confusing. Most people copied pro builds or just guessed what might work. There was no in-game guidance, and Riot didn't offer any pre-made pages back then. You either figured it out yourself or you wasted IP trying. But despite all the problems, the original rune system was a huge part of the early League experience. It gave players a sense of progression and long-term goals, especially when getting your first full page for your main champion. But for many, it felt more like a pay-to-compete system than real customization. Eventually, the pressure from players became too much to ignore. The system was outdated, unfair, and way too grindy for a growing game. Riot needed to change it. And they did, but not all at once. The evolution of runes was just getting started. As League continued to grow, Riot realized that flat stat bonuses weren't enough to keep the pre-game system interesting or fair. So they started evolving the system, not by changing runes directly at first, but by pairing them with a second layer, masteries. Masteries were a separate talent tree-like system that offered more strategic decision-making. Unlike runes, you didn't have to buy masteries, you unlocked them as you leveled up, and by level 30 you had full access to all 30 points. They were divided into 3 trees: offense, defense, utility. You could invest points in one main tree or split them for hybrid builds. A typical page might look like 2190 for a damage-dealing champion or 0219 for a tanky support. Here's what made Masteries special. They introduced actual choice. You weren't just stacking stats, you were choosing between things like increased jungle buff duration, reduced summoner spell cooldowns, or bonus true damage on auto attacks. It wasn't perfect, but it was the first real taste of strategic flexibility in League's pre-game. Meanwhile, the rune system stayed mostly the same, flat stats that you had to buy with IP. But now with Masteries added on top, players had to juggle both systems every game. You had to own the right runes and assign the best masteries to stay competitive. It doubled the prep work and the pressure to grind. In pro play, the rune/mastery combo became a science. Pros started optimizing every last point, running scaling magic resist glyphs instead of flat ones for better late game value, choosing armor penetration over attack damage when paired with certain masteries, and using utility tree masteries on junglers for better mana sustain and faster recalls. It was deep, but also exhausting. The real problem? Even though rune pages added some strategy, they were still super expensive, and most of the power they gave you was kind of invisible. You'd get stronger stats, but nothing flashy or fun, just small boosts that you didn't really notice unless they were gone. This made things weird. In pro play, runes added a big extra layer of planning, but for most regular players, they just copied whatever build some pros were using and hoped it worked. You weren't really making smart choices, you were just following what someone else did. So by the time 2016 rolled around, Riot knew the system needed a full overhaul. It wasn't just about balance anymore, it was about accessibility, fairness, and fun. The Rune and Mastery era brought strategy to pre-game builds, but the real revolution was still to come. And in 2017, Riot decided to blow it all up. They scrapped the entire Rune and Mastery system. No more rune pages filled with flat AD or AP, no more mastery trees or juggling 30 points, instead they gave us something new, Runes Reforged. And this wasn't a minor update, it was a full reset. Runes Reforged merged runes and masteries into a single unified system that was completely free, available to every player at level 1, and most importantly, actually impactful and fun to use. The idea was simple. Instead of stacking invisible stats, players would now make meaningful choices that could change how a champion played from the very first second of the match. Riot introduced 5 keystone trees. Precision, focused on sustained damage. Domination, burst and assassination. Sorcery, poke and utility. Resolve, tanking and sustain. And Inspiration, weird utility and experimental options. Each tree had a keystone rune, a powerful effect that shaped your entire playstyle. Suddenly, you could run Kleptomancy and farm gold as Ezreal, Glacial Augment for utility slows, or press the attack for heavy DPS. These weren't just passive stats, they were actual abilities with visual feedback and in-game consequences. It made the pre-game phase more engaging than ever before. Pro players adapted quickly. Runes Reforged gave them more room to innovate, and we saw some crazy strategies emerge. Inspiration junglers, tank Veigar, even smite top laners who abused free sustain runes. Meanwhile, casual players finally had access to tools they couldn't afford before. No more needing 50k IP just to match enemy stats. But not everyone was happy. Some missed the tiny optimizations of the old system, the feeling that you could gain a small edge through smart rune builds. Others felt the new runes lacked depth, and the balance issues, they never really stopped. Still, Runes Reforged marked a major shift in how Riot approached pre-game customization. It was about choice, accessibility, and player expression, and for better or worse, it became the foundation of every meta that followed. After Runes Reforged hit live service in Pre-Season 8, one thing became very clear: not all runes were created equal. The goal was variety and flexibility, but in reality a few keystones rose to the top, and they started shaping the entire meta. Some of them were so strong that they even forced Riot into emergency patches. Let's talk about a few of the most infamous ones. Kleptomancy. Meant to reward creative trading and lane poke, Klepto turned Ezreal, Gangplank, and even bruisers like Illaoi into walking gold mines. You'd proc Klepto once or twice every few seconds and watch your inventory fill with gold bags, potions, and random trinkets. Riot eventually removed it entirely because it was nearly impossible to balance. It was either broken or useless. Summon Airy and Scorch. If you were playing Poke in Season 8 or 9, you had to run these. It turned champions like Lux, Sona, and Zera into heavy lane bullies, applying constant chip damage and leaving no room for your enemies to sustain. Unsealed Spellbook. In pro play, this rune created crazy flexibility. Swapping to cleanse, then heal, then exhaust mid-fight was powerful, but maybe too powerful. Entire champion picks were built around having multiple summoner spells in a single match. It's still around today, but far less dominant than it was during its peak. Conqueror. At one point, this rune gave true damage and massive sustain, turning melee champs into 1v9 hyper carries. Riven, Yasuo, Irelia, Jax, it didn't matter who you picked, if they scaled with Conqueror, they were terrifying. Riot reworked it multiple times just to keep it from overtaking the game. The funny thing is, Riot wanted to get away from mandatory rune setups, but ironically these new keystones became even more mandatory than flat AD reds ever were. You'd often see 90+% pick rates for certain keystones on meta champions. Even worse, if your champion didn't work well with any of the strong keystones, they just fell out of the meta. Some champions became completely unviable, not because of their own kit, but because they didn't synergize with the current dominant rune setup. So while Runes Reforged gave us more visible power and better mechanics, it also made League's balancing act way harder. Riot had gradually nerfed or removed invisible power runes, like free sustain or bonus stats, favoring more clear, impactful choices, but some players still argue the system feels solved. You often see the same rune setups in every game, especially in pro play. And while Riot hasn't teased a complete rune overhaul, they've said in devblogs that they plan to keep adjusting the system rather than replace it. In short, the rune system today is much more player-friendly, customizable, and balanced than the old IP grind days, but like everything in League, it's still evolving. And chances are, your favorite rune today might not be around next season. And this era proved one thing: even when Riot resets the game, something always becomes broken. And more importantly, it will never be good enough for the community.